Something happened this week that almost never happens in American politics, and most people completely missed it. A sitting president scheduled a primetime address to the entire nation, and when the moment came, several of the biggest networks in the country simply didn't air it. Not delayed by breaking news, not a scheduling mix-up. A deliberate, calculated decision to step back from a broadcast that, under any normal circumstances, would have run uninterrupted on every major channel in America. Tonight I'm going to show you exactly what happened behind the scenes, why some of the most powerful news organizations in the country made this call, what the president's own team said about it afterward, and why this single decision might tell you more about where this country is headed than the speech itself ever could. Because when the machinery of American broadcast television, an industry that has carried presidential addresses without hesitation for generations through popular presidents and deeply unpopular ones alike, suddenly breaks from that pattern, that break tells you something the speech's actual words never could. This is bigger than it looks. Let's get into it. Let's lay out the timeline first, because the facts alone are already stunning. The White House announced a formal primetime address. Under normal circumstances, this is automatic. Broadcast networks clear their schedules, cable news carries it live, and the entire country watches the same broadcast at the same moment, regardless of political party. That has been the standard for generations, through popular presidents and deeply unpopular ones alike. This time it broke. NBC and ABC did not preempt their primetime programming for the address. CBS and Fox did carry it, but even there, what followed wasn't unconditional support. It was hesitation, disclaimers, and visible discomfort from anchors who normally wouldn't blink at carrying a presidential address. Stop and sit with that for a second. Two of the country's biggest broadcast networks looked at a scheduled presidential address and chose their regular primetime lineup instead. That is not a small editorial footnote. That is a break in a decades-long tradition that has held steady across multiple administrations, multiple crises, and multiple controversies. Compare this to how presidential addresses have historically been treated. Even during the most contentious moments of previous administrations, impeachment hearings, wartime addresses, national emergencies, broadcast networks reliably cleared their schedules. That consistency wasn't really about agreeing with whatever the president said. It was about a baseline understanding that when a sitting president wants to speak directly to the country, that access gets granted almost automatically. Breaking from that baseline isn't something two major networks decide to do casually. Naturally, the president did not let this slide quietly. He used the address itself to call out the networks that declined to carry it, directly criticizing NBC and ABC on camera and suggesting their decision should mean, in his words, a revocation of their broadcast licenses. Think about how remarkable that moment actually is. A sitting president, mid-speech, naming specific news organizations and floating the idea that their broadcast licenses should be pulled because they chose not to air him live. That's not a minor jab. That's a direct threat aimed at the regulatory foundation two major networks operate under, delivered from the same podium where he was supposedly addressing the nation about election integrity. And here's what makes it even more significant. This wasn't an off-the-cuff remark at a rally. This was a scripted, prime-time official address. Every line in a speech like that gets reviewed and approved in advance, which means floating the idea of revoking broadcast licenses wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a deliberate message, aimed squarely at the news organizations that had just declined to help deliver it. So why would multiple major networks take a risk like this, knowing it would draw direct presidential criticism? The answer comes down to what was actually inside the speech. The centerpiece of the address was a set of newly declassified documents the president said proved foreign interference and fraud connected to the 2020 election, a subject this same president has returned to repeatedly for nearly 6 years, without ever producing evidence that held up in any court of law. Network standards and practices teams, the people whose entire job is assessing legal and reputational risk before content airs, looked at that history and made a judgment call. And they weren't shy about explaining why either. Even on the networks that did carry the speech, anchors went out of their way afterward to add legally careful disclaimers, explicitly noting they had not seen the underlying documentation and could not vouch for the accuracy of what had just been said. That's not the behavior of networks trying to bury a story. That's the behavior of networks trying to protect themselves from repeating unverified claims without any qualification attached. Put yourself in the shoes of a standards and practices editor for a moment. Your job isn't to decide whether a claim is politically convenient or inconvenient. Your job is to assess whether airing it unedited, live, with your network's name attached, creates legal exposure if it later turns out to be false or exaggerated. When a claim touches on a subject with a 6-year track record of not surviving legal scrutiny, that risk calculation gets a lot more conservative, regardless of which party occupies the White House. Here's the detail that should really catch your attention. Fox News, the network that has spent a decade as this administration's most reliable media ally, carried the speech, but even Fox's own chief political anchor felt compelled to add a stark, cautious disclaimer immediately afterward, telling viewers the network hadn't seen the documentation being referenced and wasn't in a position to assess whether the claims were accurate. If this were simply a story about biased networks trying to suppress an inconvenient truth, you would expect Fox to be the exception, the one network eager to validate every word. Instead, even Fox pumped the brakes. That tells you the hesitation here wasn't about political hostility toward the president. It was about the specific, well-documented history of claims about the 2020 election that have never held up once they reached an actual courtroom, an actual judge, or actual sworn testimony. When your most friendly network is the one adding the disclaimer, "The media is against him," stops being a credible explanation for what's happening. Zoom out, and this fits into something much larger than one speech. This administration has increasingly relied on unfiltered channels, rallies, social media posts, friendly podcasts to deliver its most significant claims directly to supporters without any network standards process standing between the statement and the audience. Meanwhile, traditional broadcast networks, still bound by decades-old legal and editorial standards, are becoming more selective about what they'll carry without qualification. That split is creating two very different versions of the same presidency, experienced by two very different audiences. One version arrives raw and unfiltered. The other arrives delayed, wrapped in disclaimers, fact-checked before it reaches the screen. Most Americans only ever see one version of that split. They don't realize the other version even exists, let alone that it's shaping how their neighbors, co-workers, and family members are receiving completely different pictures of the exact same events. Here's why this moment matters well beyond this single week. Presidential threats aimed at broadcast licenses are not empty rhetoric that simply evaporates once the news cycle moves on. They set a tone. They tell every network executive in the country that carrying or not carrying a presidential address now comes with the risk of direct public retaliation from the highest office in the land. That changes incentives in ways that go far beyond one speech. Executives making future coverage decisions will remember this moment. Legal teams will factor presidential threats into their own risk calculations. And the space for networks to make an independent editorial judgment, free from the fear of political retaliation, gets a little smaller every time a moment like this one passes without real consequence. That's the part almost nobody covering this story connected. Not just what happened this week, but what it signals about every network decision still to come. So here's what actually happened. A primetime address. Two major networks declining to carry it live, a president directly threatening broadcast licenses on camera, and even his most loyal network hedging its bets in real time. Most people only saw the headline that the speech happened. Now you've seen what it actually revealed about the networks, about the claims themselves, and about where the relationship between this White House and the American press is really headed. If you want to keep seeing what's underneath the headlines, make sure you're subscribed because this story is far from finished. Thanks for watching.